Are you autistic or potentially seeking a late diagnosis of autism? Well, guess what? If you live in Australia, you may never be able to drive again. Is that true? Let's find out. Welcome and thank you so much for watching. I'm Orion Kelly, that autistic guy. I'm all about helping you raise your level of understanding, acceptance, and appreciation of the autistic community. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, check out my channels. Orion Kelly, that autistic guy, and Orion Kelly podcasts. I'm not saying stop, but I've been getting so many messages, whether it's emails through my website or like DMs on the social platforms and all those kind of things, clearly from autistic Australians who are either bringing to my attention this legislation in Australia that could potentially make it harder for autistic people to maintain or get or keep a driver's license. And also, like, apart from, bringing to my attention, a lot of people are just concerned. Like, what do you think about this? What's your thoughts on this? How this can't be right. Is this right? So what I want to do, because of how my logical brain works, is go to the source. A lot of people are quoting news articles written by journalists for media organizations, and that's great. Do they write them so you click on them and read them and then they get more money? Probably. But I always like to go to the source. Maybe that's my brain being an autistic person. Maybe that's my training studying law at uni. Degree I did not complete and did not graduate from. And very importantly, I am not a lawyer. I can't provide you with legal advice. I can't provide you with medical advice. I can't really provide you with any advice. I can just record what I'm doing for my own personal benefit, like you're listening in on a conversation. And you know what? This might be relevant to people in other countries, because presumably this is something that isn't just here in Australia. If not now, then at some point. Okay, so let's go to the source here. Let's go to the Assessing Fitness to Drive 2022. Okay, so the changes or the amendments made to the Australian-based Assessing Fitness to Drive released in 2022. Austroads. Gone to the website, and this is Assessing Fitness to Drive 2022 in big orange writing. No changes to fitness to drive requirements for people diagnosed with autism. Well, that's interesting. Tuesday, the 28th of November 2023. Recent publicity relating to the management of driver licensing for people with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, has raised concerns among drivers, potential drivers, their families, and health professionals. This statement from Austroads clarifies how neurodevelopmental conditions, such as ASD, are intended to be managed according to the National Assessing Fitness to Drive standards. What are the reporting requirements for people with autism spectrum disorder? For all health conditions and disabilities, if the symptoms of a condition are likely to impact a person's ability to drive safely, they are obliged to report this to the licensing agency in their state or territory. This is a requirement of state and territory road safety laws throughout Australia. The range and severity of ASD symptoms vary considerably. Some people diagnosed with ADS, see, I can't even say it because it's not even how I would say it. Some people diagnosed with ASD will not have symptoms that impact their ability to drive safely. A diagnosis of ASD or another neurodevelopmental disorder does not compel a person to report. Next line. Adults who are diagnosed with autism and who hold a license, underlined, are not required to report the diagnosis if their symptoms are not likely to affect their capacity to drive safely. Okay, now the next question is, well, how do you know? We'll get to that. Novice drivers and those learning to drive or who are diagnosed with autism and are learning to drive, or currently, like in the early phase, are not required to report the diagnosis if their symptoms are not likely to affect their capacity to drive safely. Frankly, from just reading this, it already seems like a lot of the news articles, including by the public broadcast of the ABC, are frankly clickbait news articles. It doesn't mean that I'm not disgusted by the wording, the terminology, or in my opinion, the clear discriminatory behaviour that is in these documents. But frankly, You're scaring autistic. This is, by the way, the ABC and other media organisations scaremongering autistic people through something they dug up and they said it wasn't quietly put out in 2022. It took you that long to find it because you're just searching for stories, probably. Anyway, how do you know? So it says you don't have to report it. Not required. Not required. Don't have to report your diagnosis of autism, guys, in Australia. Not required. Unless, of course, you think the symptoms affect your capacity to drive safely. Well, how do you know that? How do you know if your condition impacts on driving? So it says, for all health conditions and disabilities, it is the role of the treating health professional to advise about the potential impacts on driving and road safety. So for neurodevelopmental conditions, they will consider the impact of a range of attributes required for safe driving, such as visual spatial perception, insight, judgment, behaviour, attention, comprehension, reaction time, memory, sensation, muscle power, coordination, and vision. Presumably you can add ADHD to this list, right? We're not just lumping in autistic people. Surely half that list there, you could make a case that there could be impairments for someone who has ADHD, right? Well, so we're discriminating against one or all disabled people. Can we get to the bottom of that? To gain an understanding of the impact of a person's condition on driving, the health professional may refer them for a practical driver assessment or for an appropriate allied health assessment. Now, practical driver assessments are used to supplement the clinical assessment and used for many health conditions to inform fitness to drive decisions. Anyone concerned or uncertain about the impact of their condition on driving should visit their treating health professional. Let's say, right, you're born not autistic, okay? You're born, you have no neurological condition or disability, and you hit your 50s or your 60s and suddenly you go to a GP, then a geriatrician, and they diagnose you with dementia. Right, let's say, okay, so you weren't born with dementia, right? You might be born with a genetic link, right? But so that makes sense. Okay, so you've been driving all your life and you're bloody great at it, but you've just been diagnosed with dementia. Chances are the neurological condition, which, by the way, the incurable, deadly fatal disease of dementia, right, will take away your ability to drive safely. Okay, well, prove it. And you're saying, no, it won't. Okay, prove it. So you go through an assessment to see if you're still up for driving, okay? That's kind of how the system works. And the question is, if you go to see a geriatrician and you get diagnosed with dementia, for example, which God knows how many autistic people will be, probably, a lot. Anyway, you're gonna go, okay, so, all right, doc, what's the vibe here, right? And the GP or the geriatrician, the specialist is going to go, well, Orion, I think that means that, you really shouldn't drive anymore. I get stuffed. I live in the country. I've got nowhere what am I supposed to do? Get around, right? This is actually my life, by the way. Not in reality. I'm saying, I'm in the country too. Well, look, here's the thing. For me as a doctor, I really only have an ethical duty to report your diagnosis. But you, in respect to your legal duties, probably have more of a positive duty, as in you're probably obliged legally to, positive meaning it's something you actually have to do, right? So probably obliged legally to diagnose to your state's, regulators, right, the condition, the diagnosis. And then they'll go, look, thank you, Orion, for telling us you have dementia. This is all just a made-up story to illustrate. As a result, we're going to require you to do, a practical driver assessment. Okay, cool. So now that makes sense in that context. Okay, fair enough. Now, autistic people, we may well be diagnosed as autistic in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s. But we didn't acquire it at that point, right? You are born autistic or you're not. It's as simple as that. It's just the way it is. Okay, so if I was born autistic, I didn't get dementia in my 60s. There's no decline. I was born autistic, so I'll always have an autistic brain. Then how are we lumping that into the same circumstance as a practical driving assessment? Okay, so now we're talking about the idea or the premise that, let's say like me, you are a late diagnosed autistic person. Okay, so I got my license just like everyone else. So the state has rules. You must do a written test. You must do a driving test. You must pass the tests. And then we'll give you a license. And because I'm not a subcategory of human, I passed like everyone else did. But then 20 years later, say, I get a late diagnosis of autism, suddenly my driving's going to change. You have tests to make me see if I'm fit. I passed them. You gave me a license. But now you're saying because I've got a diagnosis 20 years later that my fitness is altered. I haven't got dementia, a horrific, incurable, fatal disease that robs you of your very being. I'm autistic. I was born autistic. I'll die autistic. These are very big distinctions. And this is where I find this whole thing really frustrating. Now, the idea is, okay, we've just read on the actual documents. I've shown you this. I've shown you the screen. It says right there in big yellow or orange, whatever it is, you don't have to. Unless, of course, you think your autistic traits affect your fitness to drive. And how do you know? Well, you either know, and if you do, you decide you know, you don't report. No one's none the wiser. Or if you don't really think you can work it out, you ask your GP, right? You ask your doctor. And they go, what are you talking about, Orion? You're fine, right? And then they don't have to do it. Okay, let's go on to the next part of this whole funny little fiasco. So on the Austroads website, I'm going into the physical publication. So the Assessing to Drive, 2022 publication, which you can get on the website, okay? So it's austroads.com.au. Now, I've gone straight to the neurological conditions, okay? Let me go back. Okay, so you can see it says Assessing Fitness to Drive. It's got about the publication. Let's have a quick look at the purpose. So the purpose is obviously to make sure that people are safe when they're on the roads, yeah? So impairments that can adversely affect driving ability, possibly resulting in a crash causing death or injury, are not good. We don't really want that, okay? And we realise that a range of medical conditions, disabilities, and treatments, etc., can actually influence your driving skills. So the purpose of the publication is to increase road safety in Australia by assisting healthcare professionals to assess the fitness to drive of their patients, to promote responsible behaviour of their patients. And also it aims to guide authorities in the states about making decisions, right, with these aims in mind. All right, so let's go back. Let's go down to, okay, we've got medical standards, yeah? Medical standards. All right, I'm just going to skip right down to number 6, which is neurological conditions. As you can see, neurological conditions. Safe driving is a demanding task that requires a number of intact neurological functions, including visuospatial perception, insight, judgment, attention and concentration, comprehension, reaction time, memory, sensation, muscle power, coordination, and vision. Really? You need to see to drive? Did you know that? Impairment of any of these capacities may be caused by neurological disorders and therefore affect safe driving ability. In addition to these deficits, some neurological conditions produce seizures. This chapter provides guidance and medical criteria for the following conditions. Follow me down with my mouse. The last one, other neurodevelopmental conditions. Refer to 6.3. Other neurological and neurodevelopmental conditions. Here we go. Okay, I'm just going to mark it once so you can see what I'm talking about, then I'll get rid of the blue, don't worry. Right down the bottom there, just directly above 6.3.2, other neurological conditions, including autism spectrum disorder and other developmental and intellectual disabilities. The impact of other neurological conditions, including ASD and developmental and intellectual disability, should be assessed individually. A practical driver assessment may be required. If the degree of impairment is static, periodic review is not usually required. Okay, so they're saying if you have ASD, you may need a practical driver assessment. Of course, if you got a late diagnosis, you had all the testing and you passed. So suddenly they're saying because you've been diagnosed later in life, well, your brain's changed since you got the diagnosis, so you better do all that again, right? But again, it's still saying that's maybe required. Okay, and then of course it's saying if your impairment is static. So, okay, so being autistic, you're impaired, just so we're clear. That's obviously not true, but we do obviously have challenges, absolutely. But impairment and deficits, it's not a great way of looking at it. Anyway, so periodic review is not usually required. That's what it's basically saying for an autistic person who, everything's fine, whose doctors feels everything's fine. People with ASD can have differences. Now, this is the interesting part, right? When I say autism, I go, okay, if you're autistic, you're going to have your social, communication, interaction difficulties. You're going to have your restricted repetitive behaviors, your special interests, your sensory sensitivities, yeah? And then I think to myself, what on God's name does any of that have to do with driving? No, seriously. And now you can start saying, well, there's lots of things to do with driving, all right? But, some autistic people can't drive with music or the radio. What are you talking about? Since when is it against the law to drive with music blaring or to drive in complete silence? What in the world? Okay, so it's telling us what autism is here. I'm not going to read that. You can see it yourself, okay? Although evidence from driving studies are limited. Okay, now let's stop. This is the publication that is in effect, well, what would you say? Okay, so it's advising state and territory regulators who regulate your ability to have a driver's license as an autistic person. It's telling them, you know what, look, to be honest with you guys, in saying that we should add autism to this for the fitness to drive, in saying that the studies really, they're quite limited, to be honest with you. They're not great. The idea that drivers, it says with ASD, the idea that autistic drivers drive differently from people who aren't autistic there's no real evidence there. It's limited. So they've actually said the idea that autistic people are different at driving than non-autistic people is not really proven. It's certainly not proven based on scientific standards. No way. Okay, great. Thanks for pointing that out. So then take it all off. That makes no sense. And then it talks about shortcomings in tactical driving skills are being observed. Okay, where? What do you mean? Are we doing anecdotal surveys now? What are you talking about? While rule-following aspects of driving are improved. Again, where? What? What, this crappy evidence you're talking about? There is considerable difference in the range of severity of ASD symptoms. So assessment should focus on these and the significance of likely functional effects rather than an ASD diagnosis. People with ASD may have difficulty with managing attention and distraction, understanding non-verbal communication from other drivers. I see a lot of non-verbal communication from other drivers, and trust me, it's pretty hard to not understand. I've got some non-verbal communication for you. Planning and organisation of the driving task and adapting to unexpected change. Sensory sensitivities, glare and sound. Seriously? Okay, so let's say I have a sensitivity to glare and sound. So I turn sound down or off, right? Windows up, radio, whatever. And I wear sunglasses. Are you saying that because an autistic person needs to accommodate some needs by like wearing a hat or sunglasses or, turning the radio off, that somehow become now like a deal breaker? How ridiculous. I just want to be clear about this. Personally, I actually think, in my opinion, there's probably quite a lot of autistic people who detest the idea of driving, who don't ever want to drive, who can't think of anything worse than putting themselves through the idea of testing and driving. They'd rather just chill, man. I'll just get a lift with my mate or public transport or, whatever. And some are. So now we're talking about the idea. There's two things. Number one is, I don't care if you're autistic or not. If you are not safe on the road, I don't want you out there. Okay? I don't care if you're autistic or not. If you're not safe on the road, I don't want you out there. So I'm no different to anyone else. I don't want my kids to die, right? Because someone lied or didn't tell the people that give him or her a license that they have a medical condition that actually will genuinely impair their ability to drive, and therefore they drove and my kid's dead. I don't want that. I don't want you on the road if that's the case. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, though, just like everyone else, autistic people should be entitled, as a starting point, to be able to apply for a driver's license, go for a driver's license, get a driver's license, yeah. And this, in a way, is kind of saying, you know what, if you're autistic, I don't know about you when on the road, and in addition to that, let's say you're like me. If you're an adult and you've just had a kid get diagnosed and you think, geez, this kid's just like me, which happens to a lot of us in this lost generation, and you're thinking, oh, jeepers, if I get a diagnosis now, I might not be able to keep my license. How am I going to live my life? Get to work, look after the family, here or there. And then you think, well, hang on, should I get my son or my daughter diagnosed? What effect will this have on their life? And this is at the starting point. It's like the presumption of innocence, right? Right? There's no presumption of equality here. There's a presumption of inequality, a presumption of guilt. And that's not how the rule of law system generally works. And again, I totally understand the fitness to drive with regards to medical conditions, things that will impair your driving ability and put others in harm's way is absolutely the only view anyone can take. Absolutely. No, we can't have that. I get that. So you can see here, I wanted to click on some of these studies here. These are the references and further readings. So 17 to 21. Of course, none of these are linkable. Have a look at number 21. So number one, it's 2012. That's 10 years ago. That's over 10 years ago. That wouldn't fly in a university essay, let alone advice for regulators that affect the livelihood of autistic people. 2012. Now, here's the part that annoys me. I'm going to say it pisses me off. Okay, you know what it's called? It's called brief report. But it gets worse. Driving and young adults with ASD, wait for it, parents' experiences. What in the what? So we're asking non-autistic adults how they think their autistic young people drive or are good at driving. Well, that seems pretty bloody bogus to me, mate. Pretty bloody bogus to me. Anyway, this idea that there's zero sample size that's remotely close to legitimate between that kind of 1,000 to 2,000 kind of range is nowhere near that. We're also basing some studies on purely the hearsay of non-autistic parents. It's just ridiculous. Here's how it works, okay? So for other neurological conditions, example, autism, the private standards, because we're talking about just you or I driving a car, not commercial, a person is not fit to hold an unconditional license if the person has a neurological disorder that significantly impairs any of the following. And I'm not going to read them again. We've read those many times. I'll quickly go over them like that so you can kind of focus on them, but we've gone through these. Okay. A conditional license may be considered by the driver licensing authority subject to periodic review, taking into account. Now, I think that would be similar to people with other medical conditions they've reported, taking into account the nature of the driving task, information provided by the treating doctor about the likely impact of the neurological impairment on driving ability, and the result, and must be taken the results of a practical driver assessment if required. So if you want to dig deeper into the summary of the changes, you can do that too on the same document, the same website that I've gone to. It just talks about the different things that they've made adjustments to, and you can see changes to standards part B refers to things like neurological conditions, other, and if you scroll down, you'll see, I'll quickly mark this so you can see it. I'll take that off. ASD. The review identified that information and guidance was required to enable assessment of persons with ASD. Specialist advice noted that the variability of ASD characteristics and the degree of severity were too diverse for a specific standard. General guidance is, however, provided in the text of the chapter, which we've talked about. We've gone through that chapter. So on the face of it, it doesn't actually look as bad as some people might think it is. However, it's almost like a humiliation, right? A hat in hand. There's still this kind of humiliating hoop, it seems like, autistic people have to jump through. Yes, sir, no, sir, please license, sir, right? A dance, an additional dance we have to do. Monkey dance, dance monkey, right? As opposed to every other person. This is a tricky situation. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. This is a conversation I have with myself all the time and how I would look into things. All right, I want to look into, if you don't tell, what happens if you don't? And then, I don't know, the regulators find out. Now, this is in Queensland. You can see it right here. Why do I bring up Queensland? Because in the ABC article and a lot of the media articles, what they were talking about was not only will autistic people have their ability to drive in Australia at risk, or already is at risk without anyone ever knowing, but they risk huge fines. Okay, so let's get the facts. Let's go to the Queensland government's own website. First, it says, if you do not notify us about your medical condition, you may receive a maximum court-imposed fine of more than $9,200 and your driver license may be cancelled. Your health professional is legally permitted to notify us about your medical condition. In other words, the doctor doesn't need your permission to tell the government. The first thing you'd say about that is, wow, that's a big fine. That's a big fine. My understanding is in the rest of Australia, there is no comparable fine. No other state or territory in Australia has a fine of that magnitude. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not providing you with individual state or territory-based advice. If wherever you are in Australia, you need to go to your state or territory's regulator's website, just like I've done in Queensland. I don't live in Queensland, and look it up, okay? My understanding is for all other states and territories, the same fine would be in the hundreds of dollars. Queensland, 10,000 almost. Okay, fair enough. But why, Orion? I'm glad you asked. There is a reason why Queensland have such a significantly higher fine than other states. And you know what? Again, I'm an informations guy. I like to look up stuff. Let me tell you the story why the fine is so much higher. This is a statement published by the Premier at the time in, as you can see, the 8th of June, 2008, many, many years ago. In effect, in Queensland, there is a law called Jet's Law, okay? Why? In November 2004, a driver who was suffering an epileptic fit hit a car. Just so happens that a toddler in the car, a 22-month-old toddler called Jet, was killed. There's no more tragic story than that. And that's why I said before, I don't care if you're autistic or not. If you legitimately are not safe to drive, I don't want you on the roads. Okay, so clearly legislation from this one situation, referred to as Jet's Law, was passed. The Queensland-based legislation means drivers with medical conditions must report that condition, that medical condition, to Queensland Transport. So what's the facts? My advice to you is seek advice from whether it's legal help, like the free legal services online in your state, right? Or seek advice from trusted people in your state or territory on what the actual rules say. Now, so let's go to the Queensland one because it's 10 grand. I just want to prove to you, you just needed to go to a website. You just literally needed to click on a website, right? And in the first second of that website, what's going to happen? What are you going to see? Right? The regulators aren't stupid. The governments aren't stupid. Let's go back to the Queensland government website that I showed you that talked about the 9.2K fine. Let's scroll back to the top and let's see what we can find. Let's say we just went to the Queensland government transport section, the licensing, medical fitness. Hang on a second. What's this here? A big, bright orange box. Okay. Medical fitness to drive. You can't miss it. It's at the start of the page. Medical condition, reporting requirements, autism spectrum disorder. They want you to read this, guys. In Queensland, it is a legal requirement that all drivers be medically fit to drive. And it should be that everywhere. You must notify us if you have a long-term or permanent medical condition that is likely to adversely affect your ability to drive safely. Drivers with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, that's a mouthful, they could have just said autistic drivers, are only required to inform transport and main roads of their diagnosis if it is likely to affect safe driving. If you are unsure about whether your medical condition is likely to adversely impact on your ability to drive safely, we encourage you to seek medical advice about your specific condition. I read the next line. So for start, see what I'm saying? The clickbait stuff. Trust me, guys. If there's ever anyone discriminating against autistic people, I'm going to call it out. And frankly, I think a lot of the stuff in this assessment to drive is discriminatory. But if you calm it all down, you go to the states directly, you look at it, they're like, well, in fact, actually, no. The advice or the report and then the states aren't all saying that if you have an autism diagnosis, full stop, every case must report and you're going to lose your license or we're going to make you do the test again. Just from reading it, that doesn't seem like that's the case. I could be wrong. To me, it seems like they're saying, so if you're autistic, you need to be able to tell us, right? Not if you're not, not if you're not impaired. That's fine. Just leave it. Just that you're sweet. You need to be able to be open and honest with us if you're impaired significantly. What are the words that Queensland uses? Right? Isn't it adversely? Adversely. Likely to adversely affect your ability to drive. Then you tell them. Don't know? Ask a doctor. Doctor says, you're fine, Orion. Then that's that. Now, this is interesting, this part here. If you intend on driving in Queensland, you must notify us about any medical condition that is likely to adversely affect your ability to drive safely. This includes anyone who applies for or holds a Queensland driver's license. It also applies, to interstate and overseas driver license holders who intend to drive in Queensland. There you go. So, heads up, autistic people. If you ever want to take a holiday to Queensland, or you're planning on moving to the Sunshine State, or whatever, you might want to have a quick think. That's very interesting. But I think at its core, though, I understand the premise. And that may be from having kids, right? I've got 2 kids. My wife and I would die for them. We don't want to see them killed on the road by someone in a car that is not fit to drive, right? That has some sort of condition, medical condition, that renders them adversely affected or impaired and unable to drive. We don't want to see those people on the road killing defenseless people. That's not acceptable. I don't think it's a good situation. I think in a way it's kind of just another humiliation step for autistic people, another hoop to jump through. But nevertheless, we have to protect the public. I totally understand that. It says it right there. No changes to fitness, to drive requirements for people diagnosed with autism. It says it right there. Adults who are diagnosed with autism and who hold a license are not required to report the diagnosis if their symptoms are not likely to affect their capacity to drive safely. Same for those if you have a kid who's going for his L's, right? Try and get a license. Very simple. Well, how do I know? You see your bloody doctor, mate. It's there. I hope that helps. I don't want to minimize the concern and the hurt and the harm these things do to the autistic community, because they do. Trust me, it got me. Got me really agitated. But sometimes you've got to take a step back and just look at the actual stuff, and not just some crappy news article, but the actual facts and see. I hope the conversation's helped. I hope my digging down has kind of got to the bottom of things, made it a bit easier to understand. Either way, I'm sure this will happen in many countries. And I think it just comes down to looking at the actual facts. What are they actually saying? And what's at risk? If you go to your doctor and ask them, what do you think? What's at risk? Your license. But then take it back. The doctor goes, yeah, I think there's a possibility you could be impaired. What actually is going to happen next? Okay, so you'll report that because you don't want to be fined or lose your license, right? And you probably have no insurance either if that's the case. In addition to that, the first thing will be, well, they'll just assess it individually, and they may make you do some sort of assessment-based practical test. Okay, so all you're really doing is showing that you're willing and able, and then retaining your thing. Now, the issue here is the extra hoops we're being placed through in a world that's constantly putting us through hoops and shaming us and humiliating us. So I understand that. But I'm just trying to look at it from a logical, basic, let's keep calm manner. And I hope that's helped in some way. I really do appreciate you being a part of this community, watching this video. My thoughts are my thoughts. If you have thoughts and ideas and questions and things to say, comments, put them in the comments below. I really do appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for your support. Till my next video, we'll talk soon.